Look around you right now. Today, in this explainer, we are uncovering the massive, mostly unseen backbone of the global economy, the maritime shipping industry. To give you a sense of the sheer scale we're talking about, there are over 50,000 merchant ships actively trading internationally at this very moment. It is a colossal, globe-spanning system that literally dictates the price and availability of almost everything we buy. And right now, this invisible leviathan is facing unprecedented structural and geopolitical stress.
Okay, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to hit the 80% rule, break down the 4 cargo markets, compare volume versus ton miles, dive into the Red Sea crisis, look at the alliance oligopoly, and finally cover the stalled climate deal. Let's get right to it.
Section 1, the 80% rule. We've got to start with the macroeconomic scale.
80%. Over 80% of the volume of international trade in goods is carried by sea. And for most developing countries, that percentage is actually even higher. Why so much? Well, because moving goods by sea is vastly more cost-efficient and significantly less carbon-intensive per ton than flying them on planes or hauling them across continents by rail. That's just the fundamental truth of our modern world. If an imported good is sitting in your house right now, it almost certainly spent a portion of its life on a ship. It's the single fact that justifies why every one of us should care deeply about maritime shipping lanes.
Section 2. The 4 cargo markets. Let's look at the distinct economics at play here.
Shipping actually splits into 4 entirely distinct markets with completely different economics. First up is container shipping. This is what most people picture, right? Manufactured goods packed into those standardized metal boxes, moving on fixed schedules. Second, we have dry bulk. These are unpackaged, loose commodities poured straight into a ship's hold. We're talking iron ore, coal, and grain. Third are tankers. This is your liquid cargo, which is overwhelmingly crude oil, refined products, and increasingly liquid natural gas. And finally, general cargo or break bulk. This is a shrinking segment reserved for the awkward, oversized items like massive wind turbine blades that just refuse to fit neatly into a standardized box. So container shipping is the famous one, sure, but it's really just one piece of a much larger economic puzzle.
And the cargo shares for these markets, they've completely transformed over time. Back in the year 2000, crude oil dominated at 29% of trade. By 2023, that fell to 18%. Meanwhile, dry bulk commodities rose from 27% to 36%. Over that exact same period, Asia's share of global maritime freight absolutely skyrocketed from 38% up to 54%. And this shift was led primarily by China's massive rise as a manufacturing hub and just a ravenous importer of dry bulk commodities. All that iron ore and coal literally built the sprawling megacities of modern China, which fundamentally changed the physical makeup of global trade.
Section 3. Volume versus ton miles. Let's examine some serious shipping anomalies.
So, trade volume is simply the total physical weight of the cargo. That growth is currently stalling out. It's expected to rise by a mere 0.5% in 2025. But ton miles, which is the cargo volume multiplied by the distance it actually travels, surged by a massive 5.9% in 2024. That is nearly 3 times the growth in actual physical volume. What this tells us is absolutely crucial. Distance is no longer just geography, it is geoeconomics. Ships are traveling much further to carry the exact same amount of cargo, largely because they are being forced to reroute around conflict zones. The financial consequence of these ton miles increasing is huge. Longer trips mean ships are tied up longer, which artificially shrinks global vessel availability and relentlessly drives up freight rates for everyone.
Section 4. The Red Sea crisis. Let's talk about geoeconomic choke points.
Tracking this crisis, it really kicked off on November 19, 2023, when Houthi forces seized the vessel Galaxy Leader off Yemen. At the peak of this disruption, a staggering 60% of Asia-Europe container traffic was forced to divert entirely around the Cape of Good Hope. That is a massive detour. It adds 10 to 14 days and roughly 3,500 nautical miles to a round trip, and doing that requires burning vast amounts of extra heavy fuel oil, hitting the carrier's bottom lines instantly. The financial toll became glaringly clear by Q4 2025, when shipping giant Maersk reported a $153 million loss just from navigating this chaotic transition. And honestly, conditions remain incredibly volatile and unresolved today. Despite a fragile recovery period where canal use crept back up by 18.7%, early 2026 saw renewed escalation involving Iranian, Israeli, and U.S. forces, forcing carriers right back into renewed suspensions.
The sheer scale of this geoeconomic shift is just staggering. Before the attacks, this vital choke point processed roughly 80 container ships every single week. By mid-January 2026, after more than 100 merchant vessels were targeted, which sadly resulted in sunken ships, seized assets, and tragic losses of seafarer lives, that figure had plummeted to just 26 transits per week. Think about that, an unresolved security situation, one that nobody in the shipping industry directly controls, dramatically reshapes global freight economics and carrier scheduling overnight.
Section 5. The Alliance Oligopoly. Who are the corporate players pulling the strings here?
This entire container segment is actually dominated by a shockingly small number of major carriers, operating through tight alliances. We're talking about heavyweights like Maersk out of Denmark, MSC out of Switzerland, which is actually the world's largest by capacity, and CMA CGM from France. Because these few giants actively share space on each other's vessels to maximize their efficiency, their operational decisions are deeply, deeply intertwined. When a crisis hits a choke point like the Red Sea, these companies unilaterally make the call to suspend transits. When one major player pulls out, it causes an immediate cascading supply chain domino effect for the others in the alliance. Because of their immense market share, these quiet boardroom decisions instantly move a massive portion of global trade.
Section 6. The Stalled Climate Deal. What is the environmental impact of all this disruption?
Look, shipping is notoriously one of the hardest global sectors to decarbonize. Shipping greenhouse gas emissions have risen roughly 20% over the past decade. And in 2024 alone, they saw a further 5% jump. But that jump, it isn't random. It is directly correlated to that ton-mile surge we discussed a few moments ago. Because ships are being forced to reroute all the way around Africa to avoid the Red Sea, they are burning weeks' worth of extra heavy fuel oil on every single voyage. The industry operates this aging fleet that runs almost exclusively on fossil fuels, making it exceptionally hard to clean up when geopolitical crises force them into much longer, highly polluting routes. Right now, a mere 8% of the world fleet's tonnage is actually equipped to use alternative fuels like green methanol or ammonia. That leaves a staggering 92% completely reliant on traditional fossil fuels. And the reason for this overwhelming reliance is purely economic and logistical. These alternative fuels are incredibly expensive to produce at scale, and the port infrastructure required to actually pump them into ships barely exists on a global level. So, despite all the big promises of a green transition, the physical hardware of global trade is simply not prepared.
So to fix this, the UN's maritime regulator, the IMO, tried to step in. They had been building toward this landmark agreement called the Net Zero Framework. The goal was to set a global fuel standard and introduce a greenhouse gas pricing mechanism starting in 2028. To cut through the UN jargon for a second, this pricing mechanism would essentially act as a global carbon tax on shipping fuel. It was specifically designed to make traditional fossil fuels more expensive, forcing companies to finally invest in those cleaner alternative fuel ships, with formal adoption originally targeted for October 2025.
But instead of a sweeping consensus, intense political pressure forced an unprecedented, highly contested vote at an extraordinary session in London. A motion to adjourn the deal passed narrowly, 57 votes to 49. Nations voting to delay the measure did so primarily out of profound economic fear. They argued that a new global carbon tax would drastically spike the freight costs for their crucial imports and exports, literally crippling their domestic economies. So this effectively delayed the vote to October 2026, pushing back vital implementation to at least 2028. A UN body that usually operates smoothly on consensus was entirely fractured, demonstrating just how economically fraught shipping decarbonization has become.
Which brings us to our final takeaway. We've seen just how completely dependent we are on these vessels to move 80% of world trade. We've seen how physically vulnerable they are to geopolitical choke points and how resistant the global legal framework is to environmental reform. So with critical choke points highly contested and vital climate deals stalled at the UN, how long can the global economy really rely on an aging, fragile fleet? Think about that the next time you order something from overseas. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the systems that connect our world.